Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who'll share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of American Medieval. I am, of course, Professor Matthew Gabriel. I am excited to be joined today by Dr. Blair Apgar, who is an assistant professor of art history at Kutztown University in Pennsylvania, where they research and teach on the reception of the Middle Ages into modern media, such as video games. Now, I have not heard of video games before, so you'll have to explain what video games are at some point, because I'm an old man medievalist. But they also co-lead an international research network, in fact, on the Middle Ages in modern games. So you should go look that up. Welcome, Blair.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I'm very excited about this because I am an old man, but I am an old man who grew up on video games, still play lots of video games. And so I'm very excited to talk about video games. This is basically why I started the podcast, is so I could just talk about the things that I want to talk about. And then these people would be subjected to that. So I'm sorry for subjecting you to this, but
it's terrible. I'm really suffering over here. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you could tell. I mean, well, maybe you'll change your mind by the end of the episode. Well,
maybe I will be tortured.
Yeah, that's right. So, before we get to that, though, as listeners of the show know, we like to start off with what might seem like a silly question. So, I hope you'll indulge me, because the silly question involves time machines. And the premise being that anybody who studies the past at some point has to confront the question of time machines, at a party, family gathering or something like that. And so, but our question is a little bit different. So for the moment, imagine we have a time machine, single use, but there and back. So you don't have to be stuck anywhere. But the caveat is, or the kind of parameters around this is that we have to only use the time machine for this one specific purpose. And the time machine has been presented to you, Blair, with the direction that you have to go back into your own childhood and tell a younger version of yourself, a childhood Blair, that they will someday grow up to be a medievalist. How does young Blair react to that news?
I think young Blair is not surprised.
Fair enough. Okay.
But the big caveat is they'd probably want to know why I didn't go into Egyptology.
Okay.
I had a really severe and extreme obsession even, with ancient Egypt as a child, which I feel is pretty normal, but maybe that's just for the historians.
Okay. Was it kind of focused on archaeology, or was it more just kind of generally something to do with ancient Egypt? Not necessarily. And I ask this because other people that I've asked, a lot of it is focused on they like the idea of objects in the ground in some way. And that could be archaeology, or paleontology is another really common one. But Egyptology is actually a new one. So I want to hear a little bit more about that.
I think I kind of started really thinking about excavations and tombs and stuff in a very kind of classical, mummy adjacent thing. But I got really into mummification techniques.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and I think that eventually kind of spun into me being like, well, the modern equivalent is being a surgeon. So that's what I'm going to do, which I didn't, obviously, because I don't like blood, it turns out.
Yeah. Okay.
But I was about as studious as you can be in 3rd grade, and all the encyclopedias, looking up.
Okay, yeah.
What's the tool called when they shove it up the nose and scramble the brain?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you remember what the tool is called?
I don't.
Clearly, you would have been a poor Egyptologist then.
Oh, it would have been awful.
It's a good choice, yeah.
I do remember, though, that I pointed out to my parents that there's this old school thing. I don't know if they still make them anymore, but they're really specifically citrus peelers.
Okay.
And we had this bright yellow one that I think was my grandmother's. It's from the 60s. And it has this kind of point at the end, and then it hooks over, and you kind of put it into the skin and pull it out.
Mm-hmm. And
I remember bringing this to my mom, and I was like, this is kind of what they use in Egypt. And she's like, don't tell me that. So I don't remember the name, but I can tell you that it kind of resembled one of those orange peelers.
Like an old citrus peeler. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, well, I'm sure, maybe we'll get emails after this with, well, this is what it's called. I have no idea. So then, was there something that brought you into the medieval later on? So you thought you were going to be kind of an Egyptologist, and obviously that dream hasn't worked out, I should say, yet, right?
Yes,
Because
not yet.
there's always, the future. But what ended up bringing you to the Middle Ages then?
And I feel like you've probably heard this answer before, but it was Lord of the Rings.
Of course.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
It was
Books or movies, though?
first books, then
Okay.
movies. And I watched the extended versions in college, I think maybe a dozen times each
Of course.
movie.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, the Lord of the Rings, I think, really put me in the orbit of like what the Middle Ages nominally look like in our imaginations, and throw in some elves and stuff, and I was like, this is great.
That is obviously a pretty common thread for when I do ask this question is something about high fantasy. Oftentimes it's Tolkien. It's not always Tolkien, because some people encounter different versions of fantasy literature or films or something like that. But there was something kind of, if I'm understanding, kind of something kind of enchanting about kind of the aesthetics of the period in some way, right? Which makes sense. I mean, you are an art historian, right? So like, that kind of tracks. But then that kind of brought you into the Middle Ages generally, and then, kind of on from there. If you were to go back and tell like the Tolkien version, younger version of yourself, like somebody who was just getting into that, has that helped you, do you think, kind of understand the Middle Ages in a different way? And I ask that too, because, when I've thought about like my own encounter, like I didn't read Tolkien until I was much older, but I read a lot of kind of fantasy in like, late 80s, early 90s when I was growing up, which was mostly kind of D&D based or based around kind of Dungeons and Dragons world, is like, I think it gave me a certain image of the Middle Ages, which it took me a little while to break from, which I don't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing, and I'm still kind of working that out. Like, it got me interested, definitely, and I think that was a good thing. But it still put kind of assumptions about the period, even though I understood, it was fiction and fantasy and stuff like that, that it took me a little while to kind of move beyond.
I don't know that it helped my own understanding. I think I had some wonderful teachers as an undergrad. I think that made it a really good and clear distinction, at least art historically speaking.
Sure.
But I think it's really helped me understand a lot of my students' perspectives.
Oh, okay.
The ones who kind of come into art history by way of other art and a lot of fantasy inflected things and media, and kind of having to recognize that most Americans don't get medieval history really at all. And so they might only really have like the high elven towers, right, of Lord of the Rings to draw on for what the Middle Ages looked like and like what they were doing. And I think as long as they're kind of willing to kind of set that aside as like a hyperbole to some extent, I think that is a good way for them to kind of, I don't know, if maybe it gets them to like shake off the nerves a bit or something. But yeah, it's been useful in that way.
That's great. Do you feel that the students are able to do that too? Because you were saying like that's what they kind of bring, and I absolutely agree, and you're 100% right. My friend David Perry, who we both know, right, did a kind of a little survey about what do K-12 curricula on all 50 states kind of say about the Middle Ages, and it's very, very little. Like, so, students when they come into our classes, especially like as, first-year students or something like that, like they're coming in with assumptions about the Middle Ages, but it's not from a classroom.
Yeah.
And when I ask them, it is often fantasy, video games, which, we'll talk about in a minute, or like some movie that they've seen at some point.
Yeah, I think that's more or less my same experience here is like there's so little medieval history at all being taught, and I think no medieval art history. I mean, art history generally is not taught to K-12. So, it's kind of working with like, can you even picture something that's adjacent to the Middle Ages? And most oftentimes, it's like a resounding no.
Yeah.
They're going to draw on these like heavily kind of modernized versions that have been just kind of like smashed up with other forms of history. And yeah, it's a good starting place because it can be a way to kind of like, you have seen it, you just don't know that you've seen it. And then maybe kind of work from there.
Yeah, so using kind of things that are familiar to them, right, in order to kind of expand outwards. So is that kind of what drew you to video games generally? Like as a kind of a pedagogical too, or was it just like you just like games? You thought they were very interesting? Like,
all of that, yeah.
oh, all of that. Okay, fair.
But I think primarily, one, I was kind of in the right place at the right time, and I happened to kind of meet Rob Houghton, who kind of started this like large research network. But also, I think there's something about, I'm a lifelong gamer. I hate that term, but that's just what it is.
Yeah, no, fair.
And I play a lot of fantasy games, and once I started having kind of the educational background to kind of understand what I was looking at, there was something about, it's like once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? All the kind of gothic elements that start to crop up across landscapes that, claim no affiliation with any historical moment in time. And then just trying to think about, like, how are these games even bringing this historical period to us, right? Either fictionalized or those that kind of claim, authenticity, which is a word I really hate when we talk about these video games. But yeah, and just trying to figure out, what is that doing for those who are playing it? And like, what kind of message is it bringing to them? And how are they absorbing it? And are they making any, relationships between the actual Middle Ages and the periods they might be drawing on and the games that might be using these elements?
Yeah. I want to come back to the authenticity question in a minute, because I think that's something that everybody kind of confronts. And also, like, when people look at that from the outside, oftentimes that's, there'll be oftentimes, especially about the Middle Ages, kind of blow-ups about, like, this is not real, even though it's a fantasy setting. This is why these things, I'm thinking of the controversies about, like, The Witcher 3 way back in the day and stuff like that. So, but I want to back up a little bit before then and just kind of lay some groundwork, because I think that too, maybe our listeners aren't, I was about to say readers, but they're not readers, they're listeners. Maybe they're readers. Maybe they're reading a transcript or something like that. But who's to say? That's right. It's a miracle that anybody actually listens to me anyways. But is the question of, like, how do we study games, like, as a thing? Like, and so, because I think game studies, for example, like, this is a growing field, and not just in medieval studies, but of course, in all kind of historical periods, and then outside of, history and art history and stuff like that. So could you kind of walk us through a little bit about kind of, like, how did you encounter kind of game studies? You mentioned kind of meeting Rob Houghton, a scholar, did his PhD at St. Andrews, and I believe he's at Winchester in the UK, if I'm remembering correctly. Yeah. But, like, what does that field kind of look like? Like, how do you academically study video games?
Oh, it's such an interesting question. Well, as a historian, I think I'm often having to kind of crib what's going on in other subsections of video game studies.
Sure.
Because there's so little. I just had a whole section in a paper I just kind of sent off to be published. Just that art historians have really very little to actually draw on, because we're often thinking about art style as just as an art style, right? And it's given very little credence into kind of signs and significance that we attend to assign, like, we'll say physical forms of art. And so as an art historian, it is kind of a little bit like, how can we make meaning in these images inside the game? And then kind of how do we take the meaning from the game to the player, and to the player to the real world? But it requires, I would say, I think game scholars are some of the most creative people I've ever met, in terms of just their ability to scan kind of the broader fields that exist across academia. Like, there's a lot of, like, film studies, literary studies. Yeah, just thinking about how we construct narratives. And I think those larger theoretical structures have been really useful in trying to work out, like, yeah, okay, games are great and you play them. And if we can set aside this, like, frivolity we associate with playing a game, if we can set that aside, which I argue maybe we shouldn't have to anyway, but if we can set that aside and think about the game as an actual object that conveys meaning, how do we break that meaning apart?
Yeah.
And I think if you're even thinking about, games as an academic kind of teaching tool, there's, like, a whole other kind of subset of learning out there about how to, like, gamify education. So there's a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot there. And it seems like, it seems like fundamentally interdisciplinary, right? Like, it just really absolutely has to kind of cross so many kind of traditional boundaries. And this is, like, something that I like talking with students about, is, like, you can just play a game, as you were saying, but if you can actually stop and think about all the elements of a game, for example, like as you were saying, kind of the narrative design, the aesthetics of the kind of visuals that are there, the way that it kind of walks you through a structure in order to convey plot or meaning or something like that. There's a lot going on there, which I don't think people kind of realize, and all the elements that kind of go into the creation of a game, let alone kind of how you play it and what meaning you take from it and things of that nature.
Yeah, absolutely. There are so many different axes at play,
Mm.
and it's I kind of when I'm trying to kind of relate this to students who are interested in game studies, it's like you've got film studies thinking about, right, and literary studies, and a lot of things that it's just this like one-to-one relationship of meaning that's made and then conveyed kind of in a one direction to the person who's receiving it.
Hmm.
But games often kind of have these structures. In fact, I would say most games have these structures that encourage the player to create meaning and kind of impart
Mm.
that meaning back into the game. And increasingly, games are so sophisticated that that meaning can change the game and change the output of the game. And so it's this like really interesting three-dimensional kind of modality that can be really tricky to kind of nail down because you might get lost in the weeds about like, and I find I'm often a victim of this, where you might like thinking about game styles and the way that the image itself is making meaning. And you might just have to kind of put down what, the user interface looks like because maybe
Mm.
it's not that it's not important and it's not that it's not conveying information, but you've got to pick your battles because
Yeah.
otherwise your singular study might be 1,000 pages.
Yeah.
There's just a lot going on.
Yeah, no, I think like just being able to limit, and that's why I think, or maybe I'm making an assumption here, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like something like the kind of international network that you and Rob have been kind of putting together, that's the type of kind of collaborative work that would be really important there, because it's the thing about interdisciplinarity is like we can't individually be experts on all disciplines. Like we're just not that good. But when you work with other people who know stuff, then you can actually say some really interesting things.
Yeah. And I think medievalists I think we're trained to do this kind of implicitly. And I think that there's something about getting a bunch of medievalists together, right? And every year we have kind of this large strand that we have at Leeds, and we have people who do literary stuff. Rob is kind of a more traditional historian, a social historian, does some military stuff. I'm an art historian. We've got people who are kind of studying it from various dimensions, and yet we're all kind of singularly talking about games. And that allows us, I think, to have a meeting of the minds in a way that
Yeah.
allows us to understand these as more multifaceted things. And I find that this is not as easy, I think, with some later periods of study where the stylization is a lot more pronounced
Mm.
between like what historians do and art historians do and so on and so forth, where I think medievalists are largely like, well, we can't be choosy here.
Yeah, yeah. There's a limit to our sources, so we have to kind of
Yeah,
work with other
we have
people.
to work around.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I think that medievalists might be kind of preconditioned to do interdisciplinary work. I think that's a really interesting thought. I'm curious too, like, do you think that's something, because when I've looked at some of those strands before, and like I've attended some sessions and, in the past and stuff like that, and does it seem to be more of a UK thing, game studies, or the willingness to integrate kind of game studies into medieval studies, or is it more transatlantic? Are you seeing kind of more uptake? And I say this because again, like I'm an outsider, looking in here. Is that the game studies people that I'm aware of tend to focus on more modern topics,
Mm.
not on medieval stuff. And the medievalists I know, other than you yourself and a couple other people I kind of know, seem to be outliers. But maybe I'm totally wrong on that.
There are dozens of us.
There are dozens of us.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think to some extent, I
Uh,
think there's a little bit less cohesion in the American kind of
okay.
branch of medieval game studies. But I would say, equally, there was just a wonderful workshop that was held at the University of Chicago in December. It was headed by Tom Sawyer. And it was about board games, but it was about medievalists getting together and thinking about ludology. So they're there.
Okay.
They're there. And I'm always kind of thinking about how we can, I think, better leverage game studies and medieval studies to kind of,
Mm,
I don't know, I think they can be really mutually beneficial.
yeah.
And I think we maybe need to get more interest in the medieval period anyway, and that might help.
No, and I think my question comes from my own kind of partially just kind of my own blinders, like what do I see and like kind of what's out there. But I'm also wondering too, kind of what you mentioned about kind of the workshop is that the people who are interested, or I should say, the scholars who are interested in game studies, generally among the medievalists I know, and again, this is just kind of my own kind of subset, is they tend to be more interested in from a pedagogical standpoint. So using games in a classroom, but not necessarily as kind of research objects, if that makes sense. Because I think and you mentioned that very briefly, kind of like it is different talking to students about this than maybe at an academic conference or like in a research project or something like that. Or do you not see that kind of distinction? Is that kind of a false distinction, at least in your mind? How do you talk about video games and the medieval history in a classroom versus in a referee journal or something like that?
I think I'm just kind of flashing back because I was lucky enough to attend this workshop, and I think we were kind of distinctly split into these two camps of like part of the workshop was creating our own board games as teams that were kind of nominally themed around medieval history, and yeah, it was really wonderful. And it really did kind of put us into two camps of like the ones who are trying to make a game to teach medieval history in a classroom, and those who are trying to create a game that gets at some fundamental experience about the Middle Ages.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I think they can have a lot of overlap, and I think that's in some way was really conducive to working together. I don't think your observation here is entirely off base. I think largely game studies has really found a foothold in, use as a pedagogical tool. And I think that this is partially to help, we'll say, cancel out the frivolity I mentioned earlier about, well, it's a game and you're having fun. And I think that there are some weird academics out there who are like, well, you shouldn't have fun when you're learning. So games can't really be used as actual.
I know some of those people. We all know some of those people.
Yeah, we all
Alas,
do.
yeah.
They're out there.
Yeah.
But I've encountered this a lot working in my, virtual reality work where, there's people who want to use it just as a tool. And then there's this kind of, I think, small but really vibrant community of people who want to have this kind of creative study, right? Creating a thing or an experience or a game, right? Where you can, in fact, study the game itself or study the experience itself as a way to kind of make meaning and understand this time period or how at least it kind of impacts the people who play it or experience it.
So you mentioned kind of briefly there just some of the VR work that you've been doing. So could you give us maybe an example of how this might work? Because I think, old fuddy-duddies like me sometimes, though again, like I understand kind of games and stuff like that. But I think too, sometimes people think that like exactly like you're saying, kind of like you're making a game like this can't be actually learning in some ways, right? So what are something like VR or like a tabletop game? Like how does that kind of work to help us understand the Middle Ages or like how games function and in that way?
The game that immediately comes to mind is Crusader Kings, which I think is like a really excellent example or a demonstration in some ways about how you can, and this is, I think, why I have such an issue with this kind of like hang up about authenticity, that like Crusader Kings in itself is not authentic. Like there's authentic elements to it. There's parts of it that really get at some real accuracy of history.
Yeah.
But equally in the sandbox element of it, right, you are making up history, but you're getting at kind of core mechanics. And I think that I look at Crusader Kings anyway as a potential tool to teach students about how individuals and groups related to each other. And that while there's a lot of ways you can learn that, and you can, there's some scholars look at how they're writing to each other, right? And the ways in which they are referring to each other in text. And some art historians look at how they are depicting each other and how these images are circulating. But I think in something like a video game, you can actually experience it. And like, granted, it's a simulacra of it as it wills, but I think that has utility, particularly as a tool in and of itself, and is worthy of its own independent study.
Yeah, it seems like the best cases that I've heard of from colleagues who have used things like Crusader Kings 3, like such a great example because it's so well known among medievalists and especially among like students that oftentimes come to our classes as well, these kind of strategy games, is the fact that kind of, as you were saying, is like It involves, though, a conversation between the instructor and the student when these things are happening, right? Is to talk about, like, okay, if you're playing a campaign in Crusader Kings 3 and you lose your kingdom or something happens and blah, 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 all these things, is to talk about, like, okay, why is that? How do we understand the mechanic that's there? But then also, like, what does that tell us? Can that tell us something about what was going on in the actual 11th or 12th century or something like that in noble feudal relations, or in relations with the church, or blah, 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 something like that. It seems to me like it's just a tool. Like, it can be used really well in a classroom, but it can also not be used really well in the classroom in the same way that, a reading can be, or something like that.
Right. And I think, Crusader Kings is really good because it can go really quickly if you want it to, and you can have it go for just short periods of time relatively. But I also think of things like Assassin's Creed, which is maybe the other big, really well-known kind of history game,
Yeah.
a series or franchise. And the hang up there, right, is sometimes in the more recent games, this is less of a problem because they have these kind of like explorer modes that turn off the fighting. But in like the first and second iterations, if you wanted to experience the historic landscape, which I find can be really edifying for students who've never traveled and never seen any of these spaces, you also have to have them fighting off guards,
Yeah.
which can be a distraction, it turns
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there are limitations sometimes to how these games can be used, especially if you're like, I want to just go in, and I find it really useful. There's a few Assassin's Creeds that have wonderful 3D models that you can bring students in and around, and you can have them kind of do the kind of fun little parkour moments. And in the sessions where you can turn off combat, you can have them kind of in this less distracted capacity, right? Actually interact with the scene. But if you can't turn that off, they're going to just play the game, and they're just going to be killing people. And it'll just be a massacre. So, and also I think there's a little bit of creativity to it. Like, how are you using the game, and how are you bringing it and presenting it to the students, I think will matter. And it will influence how they kind of encounter the game and how they treat it and how they play it.
Yeah, sure. So again, like, it's just about that kind of conversation, right? Like with any good classroom, right? Like, it's being a good guide and bringing the students through. So I am just thinking about like how Assassin's Creed could get really out of hand. And because I remember somebody, what is it, Assassin's Creed 2, which I think is set in Florence in the 14th century or 15th century. And somebody was talking to me about using it to show them like the Duomo in Florence and kind of the architectural features, but they couldn't turn the combat off. So I hadn't thought about that, but she must have been fighting off guards like as she was doing this the entire time.
I've been in this position. I understand this person's pain. Immediately. It's awful. But it was also funny. There's something like really humorous about that.
There's something really, kind of interesting there. So we've been talking about kind of games so far, just the couple that you've mentioned, kind of Assassin's Creed, which of course has fantasy elements because there's aliens and stuff like that. Sorry, spoiler alert.
Yeah, spoiler.
Yeah. Or Crusader Kings 3. But what about kind of more fantasy games? Do you think those have a place as well? Like, the big one recently is Baldur's Gate 3. I'm sure that people can think of others that are kind of similar there. The Skyrim games and stuff like that. Did those, do you think, have a kind of a presence? Because, the other element of this, which is something kind of, I think that kind of inherently goes with games, is not just medieval studies, but medievalism, right? Like the way that kind of we popularly imagine the period of the Middle Ages, which goes back to Tolkien and blah, 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 et cetera. So
yeah, Baldur's Gate is really fascinating to me. One, because it had this just massive impact when it came out. And it seemed like everyone and their mother was playing it. And so just as a touchstone, it has proven really useful into just being like, I've had a lot of students ask me, well, so what does it mean, right, to study like the Middle Ages and video games? Like, how do those two things relate? And often I will kind of start and kind of list off some games that I think that they might have played. And Baldur's Gate is like almost always one of them. And then I can kind of talk them through some of the various, areas within the maps that I can point out and be like, well, here's how the architecture is being used here. That is not coming from nowhere. It's not just this mythical thing. It's got real life kind of anchors in history, and that they are using these anchors to kind of relate certain things about the people who built these buildings.
Simple and Clean is a show where hosts Misha Stanton and Mayana Barron and friends talk about Kingdom Hearts a little video game franchise about really big feelings. Join them as they discuss a thing that by all rights probably shouldn't exist, but it does because it's cool. Each week, they attempt to unravel how this deceptively expansive game series has touched an entire generation of deeply earnest weirdos. And along the way, realize that what they are talking about might not just be a video game, but a whole lot more. New episodes every Sunday, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Baldur's Gate got a lot of people really mad about its lack of authenticity, which I just find hilarious. Like, they're dragons.
Yep.
Like, what do you mean you care about authenticity?
This is not a spoiler, but like the very first cutscene of Baldur's Gate 3 has a mind flayer, a giant octopus-faced thing, sticking a thing in your eyeball in order to try to transform you into a giant space monster. And then their flying tentacled ship descends into hell. That's where we're starting from. So the idea that there's an authenticity problem there is just so weird.
Yeah, this is an issue I've run into a lot, I think. I think a lot of scholars who are in my same position have seen this like firsthand.
Of course.
But I wrote about this a few years ago for the Middle Ages Modern Games. We have our kind of annual, like small asynchronous conference. And I kind of wrote about how angry some fantasy fans got when they have a Black main character named Will, and he's a Black human, and that deeply upset people. The presence of like queer identities and various intersections, it angered them so much, these people, that there was these like movements to mod these features out of the game.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, they were all over Reddit. They were all over the kind of, well, I will say to their credit, Nexus Mods actually banned these people for the most part. Although I think they've come back. I think now since the kind of public has moved on, and I think they're still there. But yeah, there was a mod called No Alphabets, which was designed to get rid of all queer identities inside the game.
Oh, wow.
And it's not just to get rid of existing characters, it also mods the player's ability to create queer identities. So it changes some of the character building features. And similarly, they also had one called White Will, where they turned the character Will into a white person. And then it also then modded every kind of feature in the game that had anything to do with like racialized hair or skin tones. And everyone got kind of converted into either like a white woman or a white man. And nothing in between. Or, of course, if you had like a varying skin tone, that was allowed.
Yeah.
Just as long as it wasn't like visibly Black.
Yeah.
And these mods were incredibly popular. They were downloaded hundreds of thousands of times, which is depressing.
Yeah.
But I think it speaks to this idea, this like kind of, I don't know, maybe like the darker side of like why fantasy has a kind of the hold, or such attachment to the Middle Ages is like some of these old, outdated ideas about what they looked like and who they were for.
Yeah, and that's something, of course, that all medievalists don't always confront, but should kind of confront, right? Is those far-right fantasies about the period itself, which then, either they're inflected through kind of these fantasy stories or video games or, kind of other kind of genres of fiction, and then just kind of, or come from the Middle Ages themselves, right? Kind of older 19th or early 20th century kind of racist writings about the period as an all-white, cisgendered, straight, heterosexual space. Do video games help with that? Or because that seems to be another kind of point at which we have to kind of confront that, or does it just kind of create more problems in that way?
I think it kind of depends when we're talking. I think they're getting better. I think that developers have largely started to respond to what academics and fans have kind of actually been a little bit more vocal about in the last decade or so. Like, hey, it's okay to put non-white people in the Middle Ages. And in fact, here's all the evidence that we have that suggests that was entirely fine and normal. But I think that there is this kind of class of like traditional, right? Like the high fantasy games, the ones that always, I think, pull really heavily from Tolkien and very uncritically so, that really kind of maintain this really stubborn foot into that history of just like the Middle Ages should be really beautiful stonework castles. Everyone should be dirty, but they should all be white. And crusades are the thing everyone loves to do, and no one's ever bothered by them.
Yep.
So, to their credit, I mean, I just wrote a piece about Pentiment and the appearance of Sebhat of Sedai, who is an Ethiopian monk who appears in the first act of the game. And I actually think they did a lot of things right, and perhaps maybe have set hopefully a new precedent for how to kind of incorporate non-white characters into these traditional middle-aged settings. They actually depict him in the style of Ethiopian Orthodox manuscripts. So you had this moment where the game kind of turns over the European aesthetics towards these Ethiopian aesthetics. And I think it really makes it very powerful. It does a lot to kind of come to Sebhat's, his own kind of history in his own terms, visually speaking. And I think it does a really good job of just demonstrating that there's a lot going on in the world.
Yeah.
And that it can look differently and it can play differently. I mean, it really is more of just of a cutscene, but I think it does a really good job. And I think it's very aware of the issue of like, okay, fine, we'll bring in non-white people, but we're just going to kind of stick them in and we're just going to make them conform to the system that we already have, as opposed to trying to alter it to make it more reflective of other types. I think recently in my memory that I can think of that did that really well was probably Pentiment.
Yeah, no, and I think, and my question comes from, I think the thing that looms over not just medieval game studies, obviously, but all kind of game studies is Gamergate, right? Because so much of the critique that we are talking about, right? Like it's not just about kind of fantasy games; it's about all games. Like how dare you have these different kind of identities, these different kind of lifestyles in my game, and that's just like inauthentic. And again, that word gets bandied about. I do want to pause here and ask, because I do want to talk about authenticity for a second, and just give a shout out to Pentiment, which is just one of the most gorgeous, most interesting games that I've played recently, because, not just kind of Sebhat, but his presence, is so interesting in that way in which, he isn't this Ethiopian monk in this monastery in Germany in the 16th century. And it's just like, yeah, he's just there. Like, this is part of it. And it really makes you kind of think in a really good way about kind of what does a medieval town, early modern medieval town, kind of look like, and, what different kind of identities and peoples could actually be there, even in this, small, I think it's in Bavaria, but I might not be sure, right? A town or something like that. So
Tassing.
That's right, Tassing. Yes, the monastery of Tassing. And this is a moment too where, being a historian, I have to say, just to spend one more moment on Pentiment too, was a little bit of a cheat code, because there's a moment there where they put a date up and like the scene changes in the date, and like I was like, oh shit, like I know what's gonna happen. And I don't want to give any more spoilers than that, but there's a big event that kind of happens there. Yeah, but I was like, oh no, that's going to happen at some point, and things are not going to turn out well.
Yeah, every time they flashed any Latin on the screen, I was like, oh,
yeah.
God, I know this. Yeah, so I feel that in my soul.
Yeah.
Yeah, Pentiment does everything, I think, not everything perfectly, but they really, I think, innovate really interestingly on how to incorporate historic elements without getting so hung up on whether or not it's entirely authentic in its like story,
Yeah, that's kind of the best way of doing that. And for me, authenticity is such a canard. It's such a red herring in a lot of ways, because these things are fiction, man. Like we were talking about with Baldur's Gate too. It's just, but the presence of different peoples can lead the people who are playing the game or watching the film or reading the book or kind of whatever, is to ask other questions, right? And like we were talking about at the very beginning, is like, especially when we're talking about kind of young men and women who are eventually coming into our classrooms, the reason that they're coming into their classrooms is because they have done something else which has led them to want to take a course on the Middle Ages. Again, it's not because they've developed an interest in a K-12 setting, because they're not, because that stuff just ain't being taught there, or, very superficially being taught, but it's because they've encountered that question and they want to ask more. They want to, seek out more information. And to me, like, that's a win, right? Like, more is more in a lot of cases.
Yeah, absolutely.
This isn't to say that all media depicting the Middle Ages is good. There's lots of bad media out there. So I'm thinking of some certain film trailers that I've seen recently, but we can kind of skate beyond that. So if you had your choice, though, like something that would really get people excited about the Middle Ages, kind of the stuff that you kind of care about in the historical period itself, and you had unlimited money, EA finally dumps a boatload of money kind of on your head and actually does a very un-EA thing and says like, okay, hands off. We're not going to say anything here. What would you like to see out of a medieval video game? And this could be fantasy or it could be kind of historical, kind of whatever.
Okay, so just selfishly, and this is
Yeah.
just because I'm obsessed with the investiture controversy, I would love to see something that really gets into the weeds about like papal and royal authority.
Oh, hell yeah.
I just think that would be so much fun.
Yeah.
And like, I think Matilda of Canossa, not to be biased or anything, I think that would be a great game to have. And one day I'll convince someone to make one.
Okay, so would this be an action? Like I'm picturing like a Pentiment style investiture controversy game. Especially like if you are sitting kind of at Canossa or as the go-between between Henry IV and Gregory VII or something like that, and you have to like negotiate the settlement. But, are you thinking you could also do like some sort of like medieval shooter, right? Where you're a Patarine like in Milan in the 1070s, like murdering all the imperial, people there. So lots of choices here.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think if you were someone who's really interested in using like original source material, there's so much of the writings of Gregory VII that survive that really give us these really interesting and very salacious kind of like looks into what was going on at the time. And I think there's something about the writing, the way they use writing in Pentiment. I mean, obviously, as it being a manuscript, it's kind of an integral aspect to it, but something about incorporating letter writing and the ways in which we communicate with each other.
Oh, yeah.
Like you've said the wrong thing and now the Pope has excommunicated you. Sorry. I don't know. I think this is something I was just talking to students about recently. I was just trying to emphasize that it's not always been copacetic, and there's some really interesting texture in history. And actually this event brings out so much pettiness in people, and pettiness is just so fascinating to watch happen, and even better when you get to play it.
Yeah, the really exciting thing about games too is that it brings out the contingency, right? The possibility, like you were saying, like there are moments in the actual kind of investor controversy between it's about the election for people who may not be familiar, right? It's about who gets to kind of choose and appoint bishops, right? Is it the emperor or is it the papacy? And there's a long, complicated history. It's super, super interesting. And like you were saying, it's a lot of epistolary, but like, what if one thing had happened differently?
Yeah.
Right? Like those are the kinds of things like where in a game, you can actually kind of game that out a little bit, right? Like what if Henry doesn't do this? What if Gregory doesn't do this? Or what if he does this instead? Then you can kind of really get at like how much of it's not just kind of individual people kind of making choices, but there's also structures and stuff like that and other players on the field. And like that could be super interesting, right?
Yeah. I mean, you've pretty much just described how I use Crusader Kings 3. I'm
fantastic.
Like, all right, we're going to run this and we're going to make Matilda the Pope, which is possible, but very difficult.
Okay.
But there's something really fascinating about alternative histories and crafting alternative histories.
Yeah.
And I think the kind of the what ifs of these history games is like maybe one of their strong suits, right? Is this idea that, yes, we kind of know how history goes. And I think kind of going back to Pentiment does this as well, where, if you're familiar with that time, of like unrest, in the 15th and 16th centuries, you know how it's going to end. And you kind of, you know where this is all heading. But there's something about watching it unfold and like having choices and kind of even just guiding one singular kind of character through different choices. I think when you do that, I think you're getting a better kind of holistic understanding, not necessarily of the actual historical event, but of like the motivating factors and like understanding how people actually act in these types of scenarios, which I think is a useful skill just to have anyway, but certainly for understanding history.
No, absolutely. Because I mean, those are the forces that kind of move the past or move the present as well, right? Like individuals can make choices, but there are structures that are in place that constrain those choices. And that even if individuals make choices, like things might turn out that way because there are other forces at work and other actors and stuff like that. And that's absolutely, like you were saying, like when you're playing Crusader Kings, which is kind of a bigger strategy game, right? Like there's other things at play. So even if you line everything up, there's these elements of chance or other decisions or, things that happen and everything can kind of collapse on you very quickly when, your child rebels against you for game reasons that, you might not realize.
You find out, poor little Ermagerd is like into witchcraft, and you're like, oh no, the monster is not going to accept you now.
No.
And yeah, it's interesting. And I think it demonstrates really kind of critically that history is not inevitable, like the way that things end up is not like foretold, and it's not as solidly determined as we tend to think when we look backwards at it. And I think that really demonstrating to students and to players and to just people that like sometimes history is a product of things falling into place in the exact same right time and right place, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that's a thing we often forget when we think about history.
Yeah, and that contingency also, I think, reveals, like that although we're trying, and I don't want to speak for you, but I mean, it seems like we want our students interested in the Middle Ages, right? But that doesn't mean like they need to be in love with it, right? They also need to understand like these were people. Sometimes they did good things. Oftentimes they did very bad things. And I think that contingency shows you that the reality of that in a different way than just kind of a stock kind of recitation of facts, or like we were talking about kind of a teleological view in which it was necessarily going to turn out this way no matter kind of what.
Yeah.
That's never the case, right? Like there's always people who could have chosen otherwise.
Yeah, and I mean, not to kind of get like too sappy about the potential of history and why it's important, but I think that when you demonstrate to people, to students, right, that like there are multiple ways that you can act in a situation. And, it's not even just about being good or bad. Sometimes it's about making like the smart choice or the easy choice or maybe the dumb choice, or maybe it's luck. And I think that can be really empowering to yourself. And I think particularly when we find ourselves in these continuingly unprecedented times, I think that there is something about being able to reflect upon history and understanding like nothing is foretold. And sometimes it can just be individual choices in sequence that moves the needle even a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think we are always kind of living through history, but man, does it seem like we're living through history now.
Yeah, what is up with this?
Yeah, what is up with that? So, no, I think this is really great. So we are starting to kind of run towards the end of our time, unfortunately, here. So I have to ask you, because I've been dying to ask you, like, what are you playing right now?
Oh, okay. So because I just finished watching the second season of Fallout, I am in the middle of a Fallout 4 replay.
Okay.
But I just recently finished Ghost of Yotei.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just the excellent follow-up to Ghost of Tsushima. If you haven't played it, it's really excellent.
I haven't played the Ghosts game yet.
Highly recommend.
But they've been recommended to me like a dozen times, so I probably just need to bite the bullet and just get on that. So
I mean, Ghost of Tsushima is really interesting in its own right because it's, medieval Japan, and we never get to see anything about medieval Japan, particularly Western media, and it was so much fun. And Ghost of Yotei, I think, is even better.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, although, of course, you had people who were upset that the main character was a woman doing things.
Imagine women in the past.
Can't imagine.
Shock horror.
No, they stared in the corner all day, every day.
That's right. Despite them being, 50% of the population in the past.
A lot of corners that need to be filled.
There's a lot of there's 4 corners in every room afterwards.
Don't worry about it.
Oh my God. I hope nobody takes that seriously. Whatever.
No serious.
No.
Intended.
All those people who get mad at women and alternative lifestyles and people who are, different color skins could just go fuck off. So I'll just say that directly. So anyway, it's my podcast. All right.
Amen.
On that note, Blair, this has been really, really wonderful. If people do want to learn more about kind of video games and medieval history, or just about kind of your work and yourself, and they have this thing called the internet, where can they find you on the internet? I'm
Blair Apgar on all socials. I have a website. You just type in blairapgar.com. Really unique names, very beneficial here. Mm-hmm. And my work with MAMG, Middle Ages Modern Games, you can find it at middleagesmoderngames.net. We post kind of a bunch of content every year about what we're working on, and yeah. Mm-hmm. And you guys have a yearly asynchronous conference, is that correct? That people can find online too. So if they go to that website, they can look that up and hear all sorts of really interesting kind of papers and research that's going on in that area. Yep, and we've got archives, I think, going back to 2020, actually. I think it is 2020. Oh, wow. Okay. All right. 6 years. So go read some stuff, my dear listeners. So excellent. Yeah. So, all right, Blair, again, thank you for joining me. This has been really fun. And let me pause here and just say thank you to all of our listeners for tuning into another episode of American Medieval. Until next week, be good or don't. I'm not your parent, whatever. And we'll see you then. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, a proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriel, and this episode was edited by Julia Schiffini.
The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/American Medieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.